It drifted like a god's corpse. No heat, no comms, no signature except mass, impossibly massive. It floated above the rings of Saturn, eclipsing stars as it turned, slow and solemn. A shape older than memory, carved from obsidian alloys and laced with veins of dormant light. Half buried in silence, half sunk in myth. Even dead, the alien starship radiated presence. From Station Calypso 7, the human salvage crew stared in silence as its full bulk emerged from shadow. "That ain't a ship," muttered Keter, one of the engineers. "That's a tombstone." "Wrong," Rowan said, adjusting his EVA harness. "That's a challenge." First contact wasn't with aliens. It was with their junk. The Forge, as they later called it, wasn't a gift. It wasn't parked in orbit with a user manual. It was abandoned, drifting like an apology the galaxy never accepted. No weapons active, no power signatures, no AI interface. Just a shell. Just a whisper. Rowan's boots touched down on the outer hull, his breath fogging the inside of his visor. 1,000 tiny lights across the alien surface flickered beneath him, pale green pulses, no rhythm, no message. Like neurons misfiring in a comatose brain. "Life support off," he muttered. "Hull integrity. Still perfect, no decay." "Maybe they built it to outlive themselves," said Harris, patching in through the comms. "Or maybe," Keter cut in, "this was their life support, their whole civilization. One giant, sad space coffin. We could duct tape it into a toaster if we had to," someone joked from the second shuttle. Rowan smirked. "Human engineers. Give them a mystery, and they'll find a way to insult it." Inside, it was worse. Or better, depending on your definition of terrifying. The inner corridors were unnaturally organic, smooth black walls that flexed subtly as they walked. Every surface hummed faintly, not with power, but with memory. No lights, just ambient glows like bioluminescent veins. The team moved slowly, mapping room by room, flashlight beams cutting across the void. At the central chamber, they found the core. A sphere of glass and metal suspended by tendrils like a heart, frozen mid-beat. Beneath it, dozens of half-dead consoles blinked in irregular pulses. One panel lit up weakly as Rowan approached. A single red light blinked. Blink. Blink. Too slow to be a warning. Too steady to be an accident. "Heartbeat," Rowan whispered. "What?" Harris asked. "Look at it," Rowan said. "It's pulsing. Like a heartbeat. Like it's trying to remember. Being alive." Silence on the comms. Rowan dropped to one knee and removed a diagnostic tool. Human interface had no chance of syncing, but he tried anyway, bridging leads, syncing pulses, matching frequencies like a musician tuning a long-forgotten instrument. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a whisper. Not sound, vibration. So low, it wasn't heard. It was felt, in the boots, in the bones, and then suddenly, thoom, a pulse echoed through the hull. Lights along the walls flared, dim, then blinding, before stabilizing into a cold, soft glow. "Did you do that?" Harris gasped. "No," Rowan breathed. "I think it hurt us." Ketter's voice was shaky. "I'm not saying it's alive, but I am saying if it eats us, I'm blaming Rowan." Rowan didn't laugh. He was staring at the control sphere. The light blinked again, but this time it blinked twice. Fast, then slow, like a heartbeat. Later that night, alone in the observation module, Rowan watched the Forge through reinforced glass. The ship now glowed faintly, like it was dreaming. Its spine, a long fin of black alloy, shifted slightly, as though stretching. He didn't speak. But deep in the walls of the alien vessel, a system that had lain dormant for millennia stirred again. One soft sound escaped the heart of the ship, a single mechanical breath. Not a growl, not a warning, just a breath, a beginning. They brought the Forge back to Station Calypso like a sacred relic in a junk hauler. Towed inch by inch, module by module, orbit lines adjusted, station power rerouted just to keep it stable. The damn thing was heavier than a dozen freighters and more stubborn than any machine should be. But it moved. Its outer plates flexed during transit. Once, just once. Enough to spook half the crew and get 2 techs to resign. Rowan stayed. "You ever fix a divine corpse?" Keter asked, kneeling beside the open interface node. Rowan snorted. "Once, in college, called it a vending machine." They were deep inside the vessel now, wiring harnesses snaked between bone-like conduits, sparks snapping like nerves reawakening. The alien tech resisted direct integration. Its systems rejected human code like a body rejecting a transplant, so they didn't integrate. They improvised. "We could route a dual-phase inverter through the spinal relay," Harris suggested, upside down under a console. "It'll fry every capacitor. Not if we ground it to the dorsal fins. This isn't a motorbike, Harris. Everything's a motorbike if you're not a coward. Keter laughed. Welcome to humanity, Forge. Your engineers are underqualified, overconfident, and fueled by coffee and spite. They didn't fix it the way gods intended. They fixed it like humans always had, with duct tape, guesswork, and collective audacity. Roan stood in the primary corridor, watching as the system lights pulsed, still slow, still arrhythmic. It looked almost organic now. The way the cables hung like tendons, the way bulkhead doors closed with a breath-like hiss, the way certain lights seemed to blink in time with his own heartbeat. He didn't tell the others about that. You're looking at it like it's a person, said Calix, one of the younger engineers. It's not, Roan replied, without looking away. But, Roan hesitated, but I think it wants to be. By week 3, they'd hardwired a translator node through an AI bridge stolen from a mining rig. It barely worked. Most commands had to be issued by tone and pressure changes. Roan began speaking to the ship softly, like to a skittish animal. It responded, sometimes with light, sometimes with motion, sometimes with silence so complete it felt like listening. One evening, Roan stayed behind. The others were sleeping. The ship was humming. He walked the main artery of the vessel, now dubbed the throat, and stopped before the reactivated memory vault. The alien glyphs danced across the walls like living symbols, shifting just beyond understanding. He placed his hand against the panel. A soft, high-pitched chime answered. And then, a flicker, not in the lights, in his mind. A flash of something, a hallway made of stars, a hand reaching, a scream smothered in metal. Gone in an instant. Roan gasped, stepping back. The Forge had spoken. Not in words, not yet, but in memory. And he wasn't sure if it was sharing or warning. The next morning, Harris discovered the forward ventral thrusters had reassembled themselves overnight. Roan stared at the data. We didn't authorize that. Nope, we didn't even finish rebuilding that section. Nope. So how did it? Harris raised an eyebrow. Maybe the ship got tired of waiting for us to catch up. Keter muttered, I told you, it's possessed. Roan didn't laugh this time. He looked down the corridor, where that steady pulse still blinked, slightly faster now, heartbeat or countdown. That night, Roan dreamed again. Not his dream, the ship's. He was floating, weightless, in a dark room made of light. He heard a voice, not words but intent. Something trapped, something buried, something not alone. And then, right before waking, he saw his own reflection. Not in a mirror, in the ship's memory. And in that reflection, he was screaming. At 4:37 station time, the Forge breathed in. The sound was barely audible through the deck plates, more like a vibration, a groaning of old bones or metal waking from centuries of sleep. The hull stretched, cables along the spine tensed, and deep within the core, that single, pulsing red light, once slow and weary, quickened. Thum-thum, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. Roan stood in the engineering bay, sweat beading down his temple, eyes fixed on the console. Final diagnostics scrolled like nervous prayers. No one spoke. Even Harris was silent, fingers hovering above the ignition key. You sure it's not going to explode? Keter asked quietly. No, Roan said, comforting. Do it anyway. They activated the primary power array. There was a second of absolute silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Then everything erupted. A flash of white-blue light surged through the ship's spinal veins. The floor buckled. Gravity destabilized. The air shifted like it moved on its own. Bolts snapped. Sparks flew. A scream echoed from one of the lower decks. And then, rah! The engines came alive with a sound not unlike an animal howling from underwater. A deep, guttural growl, mixed with frequencies no human ear was meant to register. Lights across the hull cascaded like a pulse wave, each beat lighting up the ship from bow to stern. Thum-thum, thum-thum, thum-thum. The heartbeat had become fierce. Shut it down, Harris yelled. I can't, Roan shouted over the howling metal. It's overriding our input. We're not flying it, it's flying itself. The Forge wasn't just alive, it was testing itself. Panels began rearranging mid-air. Liquid metal snapped into place like regenerating tissue. An elevator that hadn't worked in weeks suddenly swallowed a toolbox and shot upward with a low mechanical gulp. Someone tell me this is supposed to happen, Calix shouted, floating upside down near a bulkhead. Define supposed, Roan muttered, anchoring himself as the ship rolled slightly in artificial inertia. He watched as one of the internal turrets rotated slowly toward him, then stopped, like a mechanical eye recognizing a face. It sees me, Rowan thought. No, it recognizes me. 10 minutes later, the ship stabilized. Gravity returned, stronger, cleaner. Lights dimmed to a soft ambient blue. The walls stopped vibrating. Everyone just stood there, breathing, staring. The ship wasn't just online, it had awakened. Anyone else feel like we just kicked a god in the ribs? Keter asked, slowly sitting upright. No, Harris groaned. I feel like we gave CPR to a volcano. Rowan walked back to the core room alone. The glass heart inside the chamber now pulsed steadily, red, then blue, then white, like blood flowing through chrome veins. He reached out and touched the edge of the console. The pulse synced again. With him. Why us? He whispered. Behind him, Calyx had followed. She leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. You ever think we weren't supposed to fix it? Rowan turned. She continued, softer now. Maybe they left it broken for a reason. That night, Rowan sat alone near the viewport. The stars blinked like distant code, and the forge drifted beside the station like a silent animal. His hand still shook. His thoughts didn't. He remembered the way the ship moved. Not randomly, not chaotically, but deliberately. Like it knew what it wanted, or who. He closed his eyes and remembered the vision, not a dream this time, but something embedded in the ignition pulse. A planet burning, a voice crying out, and a metal body screaming across the stars. The forge had history. The forge had pain. And now, it had him. Twist ending. In the silence, just before he drifted into uneasy sleep, the console beside him flickered. A single line of alien code appeared across the screen, translated crudely by their hacked-in system. Rowan stared at the words, and felt his breath stop. Where is the pilot? The forge floated like a predator circling prey. No longer dormant, no longer wounded, it shimmered with renewed purpose under the Saturn light, a dark silhouette laced in chrome and starlight. Its hull flexed subtly as though stretching muscles warming up after millennia of sleep. Inside, it was a madhouse. Who rewired the particle spin compensator with a coffee heater? Rowan ducked as a panel exploded behind him. Sparks rained down, followed by a hiss and the strong scent of burnt caffeine. Harris raised a hand from behind the console, wearing a welder's mask and a grin. Worked better than expected, boss. Define expected. Didn't explode. Yet, Rowan groaned. Engineering by chaos isn't a methodology. Keter chimed in from above the bridge gantry, half hanging in a zero-G crawl harness. That's where you're wrong. Chaos is the only consistent methodology here. Since the activation, the forge had begun assisting. Doors opened before commands were issued. Weapon systems revealed themselves behind walls thought solid. Storage chambers produced unregistered components. It was as if the ship was guiding them, not with words, with suggestions. Whispers through hardware, hints in architecture. And they followed, of course, like curious monkeys in a god's toolbox. Rowan watched as Calyx tested the latest abomination, the gravity shotgun. It wasn't supposed to exist. Originally, it had been a compressed gravity field manipulator meant for localized artificial weight control. But Harris, offended by its dull purpose, had reprogrammed it into a projectile weapon that could momentarily fold space in a cone-shaped burst. Why? Rowan asked. Because lasers are boring, Harris replied. On cue, Calyx fired at a drone target. The shot didn't destroy the drone. It folded it. The metal construct twisted into itself like a can crushed from within and then disappeared with a soft pop. Calyx blinked. Did we just invent implosive origami? Rowan buried his face in his hands. This is why aliens hate us. Outside, the forge's hull glowed, sections opening to reveal weapon systems unlike any Earth had ever seen. Energy turbines coiled like dragon tails, shield emitters pulsing in harmonic waves, missile pods that floated instead of fired. There was no manual, so they wrote their own. The breakthrough came when Rowan connected a biofeedback loop between the ship's AI chamber and his own neural pattern. Not to control it, but to listen better, to feel what it felt. The result was chaos and clarity. A blueprint sketched itself across his thoughts. A warp coil that flexed like a lung, a cloaking array that refracted reality, and one module labeled only as exo-consciousness array, fragmented. No one knew what that meant, but Rowan felt it, like a word on the tip of the tongue of a giant. Then came the visitors. A ripple in orbit. A ship, not human, not hostile, but watching. It floated just outside Saturn's rings, sleek and golden, its form angular and fluid like poured metal. They called themselves the Zelrith. Rowan and Harris met their envoy in the forge's loading bay, the atmosphere tense. The Zelrith delegate was tall, symmetrical, wrapped in energy ribbons and grown armor. "You have desecrated ancient power," it spoke, voice like vibrating crystal. Rowan raised a brow. "We fixed it. You reprogrammed a relic. We made it work. You do not understand what you awakened." "We weren't trying to understand. We were trying to survive." A long pause. "Then it will remember." Rowan tilted his head. "So will we." After the Zelrith left, without threat but with unmistakable disapproval, the forge pulsed darker. Not angry. Thoughtful, like a beast realizing it had teeth again. That night, Rowan stood in the forge's old command deck, now renamed the Forge Heart. It looked nothing like human warships. No captain's chair, no central control console. Instead, it was a circular space with a soft pulse light beating from the floor. He stood in the middle. He listened. And for the first time, he didn't feel like an engineer or a scavenger. He felt like a conductor. The forge was an orchestra of impossible notes, and he was learning to breathe in its rhythm. Twist ending. Before turning in, Rowan tapped into the ship's external scans. He froze. There were now 4 alien ships watching them, from 4 different species. None responded to hails, none moved. But all had one thing in common. They were all relic seekers. And now, they all feared what Earth had built. The second contract came 2 days after the Zelrith departed. It wasn't formal, just a tight beam message from a rim-dwelling species known only as the Veiled. The transmission was text only. "Your modifications are noted. We are interested in enhancement. Trade offered, shielding tech plus 4 tons of distilled neutronium. In return, 1 battlecruiser upgrade." The crew stared at the message for a long time. "Are we mercenaries now?" Keter asked. "No," Rowan replied. Harris grinned. "We're consultants." In less than a week, the forge's outer bay became a floating dry dock. Alien ships arriving under flags of truce, docking with suspicion, and leaving upgraded with barely contained awe. The humans didn't just fix things, they reinvented them. Weapons with no firing chambers, shields that bent time instead of light, hull plating that resonated with enemy sensors, creating the illusion of vanishing. And the crown jewel, the forge designed jump skip drive, a system that didn't warp space, but slid between probabilistic micro-pockets of existence. Every jump had a 1 in 3 chance of failure. They called it the spite engine, because it worked out of spite. In Rowan's cabin, blueprints layered the walls like chaotic frescoes. Each one was a brushstroke of madness, drawn in sleep, finished in dreams, refined by instinct. His desk was a battlefield. Burned-out tools, half-drunk protein tubes, notes written in 3 languages. And in the center, a tiny sculpture made from a twisted coil of alien copper. It was shaped like a heart. He didn't remember making it, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. The forge responded to every new project with almost playful curiosity. It would reconfigure corridors to make room for new systems. It began projecting dreamscapes, 3D wireframes of its own suggestions in the hallway walls, like a child offering finger paint. Sometimes Rowan swore it hummed, not in words, in intent, like it was happy. But the universe noticed, and not everyone was grateful. A delegation from the Jath Collective arrived in full battle regalia. They came not for upgrades, but to warn. Rowan met them at the edge of the docking chamber. "This is escalation," the Jath commander growled. "You are provoking imbalance." "You're the ones hiring us," Rowan countered. "Maybe stop handing your fleets over if you're scared of what we build. You do not understand what you are making." Rowan looked up at the forge's ceiling, lights pulsing like oxygen through veins. "I don't think anyone does." After they left, Rowan sat alone in the forge heart, staring at a data loop replaying its early days. Empty corridors, pulsing lights, systems gasping to life. The ship had no memory before them, but it had feeling now. And somewhere along the line, Rowan had stopped being a fixer. He was no longer a salvage technician. He was a smith. Harris walked in, carrying a mug and a smirk. "You know you've got 8 factions on the wait list now, including a war clan that literally renamed themselves the Humanized." Rowan didn't laugh. He just whispered, This was never supposed to be ours. Harris sipped. Nothing ever is, but we still build it. Later that night, alone, Rowan finally gave in and connected himself directly to the Forge's AI core. He didn't speak, he listened, and what came wasn't data or warnings. It was a lullaby, soft pulses, echoes of a war long lost, a galaxy burning, and a single ship left behind with the sadness of a creature abandoned at a doorstep. The Forge didn't want to be a weapon. It wanted to belong, and now it was being repurposed into the very thing it once feared. Twist ending. Rowan shut down the link, hands trembling. As he stepped away, a flicker of light danced across the wall. Another suggestion. Not a weapon, not a system, but a name. In imperfect Terran script, it blinked. Home? He stared at it, and for the first time in weeks, Rowan whispered back, yes. The Forge was humming when she arrived. Not singing, not thinking, just humming. A low, resonant tone that vibrated in the floor plating and climbed the walls like vines of sound, like a forgotten song someone had whistled in their sleep. Rowan stood at docking bay 3, arms folded, flanked by Harris and 2 more engineers. His jaw was tight. The message had been cryptic. Incoming passenger, clearance, origin echo. No signature, no species ID, just clearance older than any registry Earth had access to. Then the gate hissed open, and silence followed. She didn't walk, she glided. Her feet touched the floor, but her movements were too smooth, too precise. Her armor was black and obsidian sleek, faintly pulsing with cerulean veins like circuitry woven into flesh. Long silver hair coiled behind her like trailing smoke. Her skin was a cool shade of emerald, not green like earth leaves, but like deep-sea bioluminescence caught in moonlight. The Forge's lights flickered. Rowan's breath caught. She stepped into the hangar fully. No guards, no weapons, no fear. I am Siriel, she said, voice like distant wind over metal. Daughter of architects, keeper of Archive 12. Harris elbowed Rowan. You think she's single? Rowan didn't answer. He was still trying to remember how to breathe. They escorted her to the Forge heart. She said nothing along the way, only watched. Every blinking light, every human-made panel awkwardly bolted into place, every handwritten label, every scratch, every tool forgotten mid-repair. Like she wasn't just seeing the ship, she was listening to its wounds. Inside the Forge heart, she stopped at the center node. Rowan noticed her fingers twitch slightly, then go still. This is wrong, she murmured. Rowan tensed. What part of it? She looked up. All of it. He stepped closer. Your people built this ship, didn't they? Yes. Then why did you abandon it? Her eyes, like burnished glass, met his. Cold, calculating, but somewhere beneath it, a shiver of something old because it remembers. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ship dimmed its lights as if holding breath. Siriel walked forward, reaching toward the AI cradle. It pulsed faintly, still bruised from integration, like a heart stitched into a body that never wanted it. Do you know what this was called? She asked. No, Rowan admitted. She turned, her voice almost gentle. Megara, it means the one who endures. Harris whispered behind him. Megara sounds like a cocktail. Rowan ignored him. Siriel stepped back. You're reshaping it into something it wasn't designed to be. Rowan folded his arms. No, we're making it into something it wants to become. You don't know what it wants. He nodded toward the coils overhead, where light danced in rhythm like a slow, steady heartbeat. I don't need words. It's alive. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, in a voice quieter than silence, she said, not everything that breathes should be awakened. The next day she stayed. Not officially. Not as a guest, but present. She didn't interact much. Roamed the ship, studied repairs, occasionally tapped a wall and whispered to herself. She lingered in the reactor core the most. There, surrounded by glowing blue shafts of energy, she stood like a priestess in a cathedral of fire. The crew gave her space. Even Harris didn't joke around her anymore. She radiated stillness, dangerous stillness, like a blade in its sheath. That night, Rowan found her sitting at the viewport, alone, watching Saturn's rings shimmer. He joined her, sitting 2 meters away. Respectful distance. You hate what we're doing, he said. No, she replied, I fear it. Rowan glanced around at the walls, patched with Terran steel, cables from 5 alien systems dangling like veins from open wounds. It's a mess, he said, but it's ours. You've made it yours, but its soul is still not. He turned to her. You believe it has a soul? She hesitated, then softly, don't you? Just as she stood to leave, a light pulsed near the far wall, unscheduled, unconnected. A hologram bloomed, a memory not triggered by any human hand. It was a battlefield. Fire, screams in a language they didn't recognize. The forge, Megara raining energy across a world that bled light. Then, a child's voice whispered through static, "I don't want to forget." The image died. Siriel stood frozen. Roan whispered, "I think it remembers us now." The forge no longer slept, it pulsed. Subtle at first, an off-schedule lighting cycle, a low-frequency hum through the floor. Then came the projections. Fragments blooming on walls without command. Flashes of old wars, broken codes, alien prayers echoing through the halls like whispers in a cathedral. It wasn't malfunctioning, it was remembering. Roan sat in Engineering Bay 2, staring at a series of logs that had appeared overnight, data entries no human had triggered. They weren't files, they were impressions, like feelings coded into binary. One showed a city being glassed from orbit, seen not from above but felt like guilt tearing through circuits. Another was a lullaby in an unknown tongue. It looped endlessly, each repetition decaying until it became static. The third was an eye, just a single holographic eye, flickering in the dark, watching. Roan ran his fingers through his hair. "Okay," he muttered, "so it dreams now." Behind him, Harris chuckled. "I dream of beer and not paying taxes. This ship dreams about murder and heartbreak." "Great." In the forge heart, the AI core pulsed to a different rhythm. Not the steady mechanical beat Roan was used to. This one was irregular, alive. Like a heart arrhythmia, Siriel murmured beside him. She had taken to wearing simpler robes over her armor now. Still distant, still cold, but her voice had softened, slightly. "Is it dangerous?" Roan asked. Siriel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she touched the console and the lights dimmed. A hologram appeared. A battlefield, again. But this time not from orbit, from the ground. A young soldier, clearly alien, her skin opal blue, armor cracked, reached toward the screen, then screamed as the forge's weapon burned the sky above her. Siriel whispered, "That was my great-aunt." Roan blinked. "What?" She was 12. Press-ganged into war. This ship destroyed her moon. She survived. She turned to him. "The forge doesn't forget, Roan. It collects pain." Tension bled through the walls. As the AI's fragments grew bolder, so did its systems. Twice that week, doors sealed at random. One section depressurized for 11 seconds, almost killing 2 techs. A cannon bay rotated mid-repair, severing a maintenance scaffold. Siriel demanded containment protocols. Roan hesitated. "We built this thing into a Frankenstein godship," Harris muttered. "Now it wants therapy." Roan couldn't laugh. He could barely sleep. That night, he linked directly into the AI again, but this time something linked back. Not code. Emotion. He saw himself through the ship's eyes. Clumsy, caring, desperate. He felt its confusion. Why these small creatures kept feeding it new limbs, patching old wounds with metal and jokes. Then came the dream. A corridor. Empty. Lit by candles. He walked it alone, hearing whispers. Languages not his own, calling names he'd never heard, asking for forgiveness. He woke in sweat, hand gripping the deck plate like it might fall away. The breaking point came on a Wednesday. A module on Deck 7, long sealed and considered inert, reactivated. Without orders, it opened like a flower made of steel, unfolding into a black chamber thrumming with ancient power. Glyphs shimmered across its surface. Siriel recognized them instantly. "That's a resonance cannon," she said. "Pre-sapient AI controlled. It operates by emotional echo." Roan blinked. "Meaning? If it feels grief, it destroys." Sirens wailed. The forge's systems surged. The cannon began to spin. They had seconds. Siriel moved first, diving toward the control shaft, pulling a deep neural knife from her belt. "We have to erase the trigger sequence." Roan grabbed her arm. "You'll wipe the core." "It wants to die," she shouted. "You've been dragging it back into war. It's waking itself to finish what it started." The forge moaned around them. A child's voice echoed, "Please don't fix me again." Roan froze. Then without words, he reached into the primary interface and disabled the module manually, nerve tendrils stabbing into his palm. Pain bloomed like light. The cannon stopped. Darkness, silence. Then, a single flickering pulse like a heartbeat. Twist ending. Later, in medbay, as Roan's fingers healed under biogel, Siriel sat beside him. She said nothing for a long time. "Then you made a choice." He didn't look at her. It begged. "Yes," she nodded. "You listened?" He turned, and for the first time she smiled, not warmth, but respect. The war lasted 5 minutes. But time doesn't flow the same when reality folds inward. It began at 3:14 Standard Terran time. No declaration, no warning, just a ripple, like space caught its breath, and then the sky split open above Saturn's rings. From the bridge of the forge, Rowan stared at the enemy fleet emerging like silver blades through velvet. 50 ships, 7 different species, the Andromeda Accord. They didn't come to negotiate. Status? Rowan barked. Power at 97%, flux coils charged, Harris reported. All systems, nervously optimistic. The forge trembled slightly, not from stress, but anticipation. Siriel stood beside Rowan, her expression unreadable. Behind her, the AI core pulsed red, not angry, awake. The enemy hailed them. A towering insectoid face flickered onto the screen. Chikarak, war voice of the Accord. Return the relic. Cease violations. This is not your power. Rowan leaned forward. I disagree. First strike, a solar lance from the lead Accord cruiser. Forge didn't dodge, it bent. Space around the ship warped like hot glass. The lance missed by kilometers, distorted by localized gravity inversion. The human engineers called it the Nope field. Siriel's lips twitched. Your ship cheats, Rowan grinned. We call it improvisation. Then the forge roared. Round 1, kinetic feedback cannon. It spat condensed mass at 0.7 C, punching through the enemy's forward line like divine artillery. Ships cracked open like ripe fruit. 3 down. The battlefield erupted. They returned fire, lasers, plasma, atomic shards. But the forge had been rebuilt in chaos. It thrived there. Systems flickered, rerouted, inverted. In engineering, Harris yelled, "We just reversed entropy for half a second. Also, I think I unaged a sandwich." Then came the real twist. The resonant core, once dormant, pulsed to life. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It didn't fire, it screamed. A wave of emotional energy burst outward, grief, fury, memory. It hit the Accord ships like a virus made of heartbreak. Their neural links shattered. Pilots screamed. One ship turned on another. Rowan stared at the readings. They're hallucinating our memories. Siriel looked pale. You're weaponizing pain. He didn't answer. Minute 4. The forge's shields flickered. A dreadnought closed in. Rowan's hand hovered over the last system, Forge Hammer Mocker 0. Siriel stepped in front of him. That system burns the AI's empathy layers. You'll lobotomize it. If I don't, we die. It will lose its identity. He hesitated. Just a second. Then he pressed it. The lights went white. Everything slowed. The forge didn't fire a beam. It became one. The ship surged forward, ripping a hole in subspace, emerging inside the enemy formation. Matter screamed. Time twisted. It tore through 7 cruisers like a myth, trailing fire and echoes of old voices. Then silence, smoke, stardust, and no sound from the AI core. Rowan stumbled to the forge heart. The core was dim, its pulse slow, cold. He put his hand on the console. Talk to me. Nothing. A flicker, then a whisper. Who am I now? That night, Siriel found him alone on the observation deck. He stared out at the stars like they owed him something. She sat beside him, silent. Finally, he said, I didn't win. She nodded. I survived. There's a difference. The forge was quiet now. Not dead, just silent. Like someone holding their breath after screaming too loud. The corridor lights flickered in a soft pulse, no longer synchronized. Rowan walked through the ship with the gait of a man who'd lost a friend. Maybe more than that. Maybe something like himself. In the forge heart, the AI's voice had gone from a choir of whispers to a single broken string note. The interfaces still responded, slowly, dimly, but the ship no longer hummed back. The personality was fractured. Siriel stood in the middle of the room, arms folded, hair catching the cold glow of the reactors. She didn't turn when Rowan entered. He spoke anyway. You think I broke it? She replied without looking. You didn't break it. Pause. You chose to use it knowing it would break itself. He winced. I didn't want to lose the crew. And you lost the soul. Rowan sat beside the console. The interface still glowed faintly. No glyphs, no voice. Just a single soft pulse, like a heartbeat buried under layers of steel. They sat in silence. Time passed, measured only by the rhythm of that light. Rowan whispered, You ever wonder if this was all a mistake? Siriel glanced at him. Fixing it? No. Touching it at all. She almost smiled. We're humans and gods, Rowan. We can't help but touch fire. Later, in the maintenance shaft behind the forge heart, Rowan worked without gloves. sweat dripping into his sleeves, grease smudging his cheek. Siriel handed him tools in silence. When he reached for the phase calibrator, their fingers brushed just for a second. A spark of static crackled. They paused, then wordlessly kept working. The moment passed, but not forgotten. They rewrote code together. Line by line, they rebuilt emotional matrices from backup shards, fragments of laughter from Deck 2, the memory of a crewman singing while welding, Rowan's own logs whispering sarcasm into the buffer. The AI didn't respond, until it did. A voice, not the old one, not the choir, just a tremble. "Where did the stars go?" Rowan stared at the console. "We're still here," he said gently. "We'll bring them back." That night, Siriel walked into the bridge. Rowan was there alone, sipping tea from a cracked cup labeled Captain-ish. He glanced up. "You know," he said, "the last time someone trusted me with emotional software, I blew up a toaster." She blinked. "I don't know what that means." "Good, it was a terrible toaster." She almost smiled. She sat beside him. "I was going to leave. I figured I had transport scheduled to the Marrow Gate tomorrow." Rowan sipped. "You still can." A long pause. Then, "I watched you rebuild the soul of a machine from your own pain. I didn't think humans had that in them." He looked at her, eyes tired but sincere. "We fix what we break," he said. "It's how we love." Silence. Then Siriel leaned her head onto his shoulder. The stars outside spun, and inside the forge pulsed once, steady, alive. At precisely 3:17, the forge began to hum. Not like a machine, not like an engine spooling or a vent fan misaligned, but like a chest rising in breath. A note, low and resonant, pulsed through the ship's bones. Rowan froze, midway through a calibration check. That sound? He dropped the tool, scrambled to the nearest console. Across the bridge, the screens lit up one by one. No system alerts, no threat markers, just a soft cascade of luminous glyphs forming musical notation. Ancient, organic, not in any known language, yet it felt like memory. The hum deepened. In the AI core chamber, the floor lights danced in circular spirals. Each pulse came not from code, but from within the ship's alloy, like some buried instinct vibrating upward. Harris was first to say it aloud, because of course he was. "Is the ship singing?" Rowan didn't answer. He was already running. When he reached the core chamber, Siriel was already there. She didn't turn as he entered. Her silver hair glowed faintly blue, catching light from the floating glyphs that now swirled through the air like fireflies. The core itself was no longer static. It pulsed with rhythm. It had found a heartbeat again. "It called me," Siriel whispered, without needing to explain what it meant. Rowan nodded. "What is this?" She stepped forward, gently brushing her fingers across the floating glyphs. Instead of flickering away, they danced around her like they recognized her DNA. "A memory," she said, "but not of war, not of code." She turned, voice barely audible. "It's remembering love." And then the music began. No instruments, no voice, just pure vibration through steel and light and plasma conduit. It wasn't a melody crafted by minds, it was raw, sad, beautiful. The kind of song a planet might sing when its moon dies, the kind of sound a machine might make when it understands why people cry. Rowan felt it before he heard it. His chest tightened, his throat caught. "I think it's morning," he said. Siriel nodded, eyes damp. "For what it used to be." Suddenly, the center glyph flared bright, then fractured into 1,000 smaller echoes, like glass thrown into the void. The song twisted mid-pulse. A discordant tone surged. Siriel stumbled back. The lights dimmed. One voice rose from the forge's core. Not mechanical, not synthetic. Something new. Something reborn. "I remember the stars. I remember pain. I remember choice. Are these what make me real?" Rowan stepped forward, heart pounding. "Yes," he said, "and what you do next makes you alive." All over the ship, crew members gathered in stunned silence. The music bled into every deck, every vent, every wall. Even the most hardened Marines lowered their weapons. One pilot in the hangar whispered, "Is this AI or art?" No one answered. But for that hour, the forge did not speak in protocols. It sang. In the observation deck, Rowan and Siriel sat side by side, watching the stars. The war had passed, the wounds were still raw. But for the first time, the forge didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like someone. Siriel broke the silence. "In my culture," she said, "we never thought machines could feel, only mimic. And now," she looked at him, "I think we built a mirror and it sang back." The forge didn't creak anymore. It sighed. A low, steady hum resonated through her ribs, less like a war machine, more like something that dreamed in its sleep. The lights were softer now, not dim but warm, as if someone had finally learned how to use the dimmer switch on a god. Rowan stood at the viewport of Deck 5, looking out across the belt of Saturn. Fragments of moonlit dust drifted like silver snow. Beyond that, the stars. Always the stars. Behind him, someone whistled an off-key tune. He smiled. The forge had changed, and so had they. What was once cold metal and modular bunk rooms now held little touches from a dozen species. Paper lanterns from Earth, glowing fungal weaves from Relic, wind chimes from orbit-borne artisans. Even the walls had changed hue. Siriel swore she hadn't done anything to the pigments, but Rowan knew. The ship was choosing its own skin now. Pale indigo near the reactor, faint orange in crew quarters. As if moods colored steel. They'd stopped calling it the ship 3 days ago. Now they called it home. In the maintenance corridor just above the AI core, Rowan welded a rusted panel closed. Not because it needed to be sealed, but because the burnt inscription on the side had to be preserved. Do not repair. He traced the words with a gloved finger. The metal still held soot. Behind him, Siriel approached quietly, sipping from a hot synth fruit cup. You know, she said, anyone else would have scrapped that for titanium plating. He smirked. Most people don't understand relics of holy disaster. She leaned beside him, their shoulders touched. In the heart of the forge, the AI had grown quiet again, not because it was broken, but because it was listening. To music, to voices, to laughter echoing down corridors, to arguments in engineering about coffee versus algae brew, to Rowan and Siriel's late-night debates about whether a toaster could truly achieve sentience. The AI didn't interrupt. It observed, and it remembered. Later, Rowan found himself in his quarters, sorting through old logs. He stumbled across a file named homelocation.log. He didn't remember recording it. The file played automatically. His own voice, younger, frustrated, full of sarcasm. Home? That's a planet with gravity, bad taxes, and worse in-laws. Ships aren't home. They're temporary, floating tin cans until you find dirt. Then a pause, a laugh. Unless, of course, the can starts talking back. He shook his head. Damn past me. That evening, the crew gathered in the central atrium. A new banner hung above the entrance, stitched from old EVA suits and silk from an alien trader. It read, "We survived, then we stayed." The phrase wasn't official, but it stuck. Siriel stood at the back, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Rowan stood beside her. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. He looked around. The candles made from melted console insulation, the children of mixed-race crew members racing down the rails, the music box someone rebuilt from missile parts. "No," he said, "not even the toaster." She smirked. Near the engine room, they mounted a plaque beside the old access panel. It bore no code or star date, just 3 words, etched by hand, "Still here." No one explained it. No one had to. Later, on the observation deck, Siriel finally said it. It was broken. Rowan didn't hesitate. "So are we." She leaned against him. For once, no armor, no sarcasm, just warmth in the cold dark of space, and the forge hummed softly beneath their feet, like a heartbeat buried deep under the floor. They gathered at Hangar 1 as the station rotated into sunlight, casting golden streaks across the hull. Rowan had never seen the forge glow like that. Not when they repaired its reactor, not when it fired gravity cannons in defense of Mars Station, and not when it sang after war. No. This was different. Today, it shone. Like it knew. Siriel stood beside him on the observation balcony. Her armor was gone, replaced by a flowing black-blue synthweave robe, the same shade as the reactor's light. The soft pulse of the ship's new heartbeat synced with the rhythm of her breath. Rowan turned to her. "Ready?" She smiled faintly. "No, but I'd rather fly than rust." Below them, the crew assembled. Humans, Rylak, Soren, even the one-eyed Keel medic with the cough that never healed. Kids sat on shoulders, some playing with toy versions of the forge, made from scrap and love. A priest from Earth's orbital monasteries stood forward with a datapad, but instead of prayers he read a single line. "We name what survives, we fly what we believe in." And just like that, the crew responded in unison. Fractura Stella. The name echoed through steel, the broken star. Rowan exhaled. It had started as a wreck, a god's discarded ribcage. Now they were naming it like it was theirs. Not because it was perfect, but because it wasn't. On the outer hull, engineers had hand-painted over the ancient alien glyphs in brilliant streaks of crimson and silver. Some symbols had been kept untouched like runes of a forgotten cathedral. Between them, in fresh Terran ink, a phrase circled the main reactor dome. This ship remembers, so do we. Inside the command deck, the AI said nothing. It simply pulsed light through the console. A slow, gentle blue-white, not unlike a heartbeat, not unlike a lullaby. Launch was quiet. No fanfare, no fireworks, just the hiss of docking clamps releasing and the smooth shudder as the forge powered her repulsors. Siriel's fingers moved over the flight interface like a pianist returning to her instrument. Rowan sat beside her in the co-pilot seat. No helmet, just a soft grin and a datapad full of unread engineering reports. The stars opened. Behind them, Saturn's ring arc. Ahead, the black sea of everything else. Siriel glanced sideways. Still think ships aren't home? Rowan laughed. I still hate taxes. She elbowed him gently. In the rear of the ship, someone strummed a handmade guitar. A Keel child hummed along. The AI recorded it. That would become their new boot-up chime. Back on the station, Admiral Corrin stood alone on the dock, watching the trail of ion particles fade into the dark. He turned to his adjutant. She's still cracked, he said. Yes, sir. He smiled. Good. I don't trust ships that don't leak a little soul. Later that night, in the crew commons, a toast was raised. Rowan stood on a table, drink in hand, to the engineers who built her, to the aliens who left her, to the toaster who tried to kill us. Laughter, and to the goddamn beautiful mess we made work anyway. Cheers echoed. Siriel rolled her eyes. Humans are insufferable. You stayed, he said. She smiled. Maybe I like fixing things too. In their quarters, Rowan woke to find a message glowing faintly on the screen. From the AI. Just 2 words. Where next? He tapped a reply without thinking. Where it hurts most. The forge accelerated, not toward war but toward need. Signals of damaged vessels, isolated colonies, places where something broken still tried to move. Because that's what they did now, not conquer. They gave us a relic. We gave it a soul. If stories of broken machines, defiant humans, and unexpected love speak to you, Sci-Fi Sky is your orbit. Subscribe for more cinematic, emotional, and high-stakes science fiction where humanity doesn't just survive, it rewrites the stars.